Well, good afternoon, Kiddly-winkets and Mummy and Daddy. Here we are again. Grandad reading some more of The Little Wooden Horse. Now, if you remember, well, before we get into that, let's say that the timestamp is Wednesday, the 13th of October. It's 3 in 2001, and it's 3:32 in the afternoon. Now, as we've been reading This Little Wooden Horse, the last chapter that we read was The Little Wooden Horse Goes Down the Mine. You remember? The mine is a big hole in the ground. And usually stuff is mined out of a mine, it's just taken out of a mine. Precious metals, metals that are well looked for as far as man is concerned. In this case, it was a coal mine where they take coal out for making fires with and for cooking with. So the little wooden horse had gone down the mine for a job. He'd spent some time down there, and on one of his journeys down the mine, the mine actually had an explosion inside the mine. This can happen because different gases build up and they can explode. Okay, this is one of the problems with working down mine shafts and deep down in the ground. You can have explosions. Well, the little wooden horse was buried, and his friends, his other horses, were buried. They managed to find their way out. But so the little wooden horse found his way out, along with most of the men from the mine shaft, and he ended up in a field. The horses all ended up in the field, and the little wooden horse was in the field with them. But he was quite shocked. He was quite suffering with shock about being inside an explosion almost. Inside an explosion, that's a pretty nasty place to be. And buried. So he had to dig himself out and help his other horses get out. When they had, I'll just read this last part of that so that we can catch up to where we were. When they had been shut into the field, the three ponies galloped around and round, wild with joy at being safe and free again. The little wooden horse stayed where he was in a corner of the field, quite quiet and still. He crouched in the long grass while the hours went by, and the other ponies shrilled and gambled. They were and gambling about the field, like they were free and happy. Now and then he shook his head to hear the 3 coins jingle that still remained in his little wooden body. But he did not nibble at the clover or roll in the sunshine, for a terrible thing had happened to the little wooden horse after all those weeks that he'd been down in the mine. He had become quite blind because it's so dark down there that the eyes become really, really sensitive to light. So he probably had his eyes closed. So here we go. Chapter 9. The little wooden horse sees the king. When nightfall came, the other pit ponies were taken back to the mine, but the little wooden horse was left behind. He crouched in his corner of the field, and for the first time for weeks heard the familiar night noises that he remembered in the forest, where he had left Uncle Pedder. The owls hooting, the twittering bats, the rustling foxes, the dry hissing of the hedgerow, riddled by small brown mice skittering about as they do. When the sun rose, he could feel it shining on his battered body. Battered body is a body that's been knocked around from pillar to post. And he's looking pretty rough. All the paint's been knocked off. But for all he could see, he might still have been in the darkness of the mine. Now I shall die, said the little wooden horse, for I have no money and no eyes and only 3 wheels. What use can I be to my dear master now?" But before he could die, he heard footsteps in the grass, and two kind, warm little hands encircled his body. "Oh, oh," said a kind, warm little voice, "what a beautiful little wooden horse." Now, it was so long since the little wooden horse had been called beautiful that the surprise quite revived him, and he blinked his poor little blind eyes and decided not to die for the present. So that was good, eh? He's not going to die for the present. He's not going to die in the meantime. As he blinked, it seemed to him that a ray of light darted across his eyes, as though he were not, after all, so blind as he had supposed. The miner's little boy wrapped the little wooden horse in his blouse and took him back to the village. There he scrubbed him under the pump, that's the village pump in the town square, till his paint began to show again. A glimpse of his red saddle appeared under the coal dust, and presently his 3 little stripes peeped out too, his 3 little blue stripes. When his mane was brushed, and you know what his mane is, that's the big long hair down the back of his neck that horses have. When his mane was brushed and combed, the little wooden horse began to feel a new fellow, while little by little his poor eyes were recovering, till at last he could see the miner's little boy himself, and the little boy's mother, and his baby sister, and the spotlessly clean kitchen to which he had been brought. There he goes. There he is, getting a scrub up by the village pump. There's the pump handle, and you woggle that pump handle and you can get water out of the spout. And he's getting all cleaned up. In the evening, the miner himself came home, and this was the best moment that the little wooden horse had known for many a day. For no sooner had he finished his supper than the boy's father brought out his pocket knife and cut 4 new wheels for the little wooden horse. Wow, hey, fancy that. 4 new wheels for the little wooden horse, which he fastened on with bright new nails. Then, while the little boy watched and admired, with his mouth hanging open wide, enough, said his mother, to catch all the sharks in the bay. With his mouth hanging wide open enough, said his mother, to catch all the sharks in the bay. He must have had his mouth wide open. Okay. The miner brought out a pot of red paint and a pot of blue and painted up the little wooden horse till you would have said he had come straight out of Uncle Peter's sack that very night. So he's looking pretty spiffy. He's looking pretty good by the time he was all painted up, new wheels. The little wooden horse and the miner's boy were so pleased they ran around and round the kitchen, waking up the baby sister, so that they both got a scolding from the little boy's mother, and the miner got a scolding too for making such a noisy pair of them. But on the whole, everyone was very happy, and the evening passed pleasantly away. The miner's boy and the little wooden horse soon became great friends. The little wooden horse thought no more about going back to work in the mine, for his coat was far too fine and fresh, and if he spoiled it, who would give him another? Then he did not want to become blind again, and the explosion in the mine had frightened him very much, which it would, wouldn't it? He still thought a great deal about Uncle Peter, on whose account the loss of his money troubled him very much. Well, in theory, he could have gone back to the coal mine and asked them for the money that he'd already earned. I don't think that they could have held that back if he had gone back. But we'll see what the story says, eh? The miner's boy soon found the last 3 coins that jingled about inside his wooden body. "What a splendid money box that would make," said the miner's boy. So he took his own coins out of the red stocking his mother had given him to keep them in, and put them down the hole in the neck of the little wooden horse. His baby sister thought this made a good rattle, but rattle or money box, the little wooden horse did not mind. He guarded the little boy's money carefully, along with his own, and played with the baby sister all over the floor. How's that sound, Abby? All over the floor with the little wooden horse. I could see you doing that. But the time came when he began to think once more about seeking his fortune. So he was glad enough when one day the miner's boy said to him, "The days are pleasant enough, my little wooden horse, but it seems to me that there's more in the world for you and me to see. All my life I have wanted a little wooden horse of my own, so that I could go to the city and see the king and the 10 little princes and princesses. Then I would be a beautiful present. Then I would buy a beautiful present for my father and for my mother and for my baby sister, and ride back here to the mine with a sack full of cakes and surprises. Now that I have 5 silver coins of my own, I really think we had better go, my little wooden horse." Wow, that's a turn up for the books. The little wooden horse had nothing to say against this, for he asked for nothing better. So one morning the two of them rose before anyone was awake and trundled up the long road towards the city. The miner's boy first, walking very fast because he was happy and felt a man, and behind him came the little wooden horse on his 4 new wooden wheels, wishing that Uncle Peter could see him with his fine newly painted saddle and 3 blue stripes on his back. He carried the empty sack that the miner's boy meant to fill with cakes and presents when he went home. "Perhaps I shall find some work to do in the city to get some more money," said the little wooden horse as he trundled along the long road behind the miner's little boy. When at last they came to the city, they found the streets thronged with people. That means there were a lot of people walking around the streets. It was full of people, standing, watching, waiting, but doing very little else, it seemed. So they were standing around watching and waiting. I wonder what they were watching and waiting for, guys, eh? Do the people always behave like this in the town? The miner's little boy asked of a passerby, for he was not used to seeing people so idle. That's people who are not working, are just messing about and looking around. He's not used to seeing people like that. At home, it was his mother, or in the mine, his father, and the other men who were always bustling about and being busy. In the little boy's life, nobody stood still. To the little wooden horse, too, it seemed very strange. Although by now he had seen more of the world than the miner's little boy. "Why, it's a holiday," said the man, smiling kindly down at the miner's boy and his little wooden horse. "It's the king's birthday today, and he is going to drive all around the city with the queen and the 10 little princes and princesses in the royal coach driven by 10 white horses. That's what we are all waiting to see." Now, all his life, the miner's little boy had been waiting to see the king and the queen and the 10 little princes and princesses. So he and the little wooden horse pushed themselves into the crowd to wait until the procession should come along. Have you ever been somewhere where you've had to wait for a procession to come along? You probably have. In fact, I know you have. So these things happen sometimes, usually around Christmas time. They waited and waited, but nobody came, and the people began to grow restless. They began to start moving and talking to one another and saying, "What's going on here? There's nothing really much going on. Where's the king?" They moved and craned and peered and shuffled. Shuffling is sort of doing all of those things. And although the miner's boy and the little wooden horse held tightly onto each other, they could not help being pushed and jostled about by the crowd, until presently they found themselves squeezed right to the back of all the people. And then they were jostled out altogether into a new road, with 100 people between them and the road where the king must pass in his coach, with the queen and the 10 little princes and princesses. But no coach came, and everyone was looking at one another and saying, "Where is the king? Where is the queen? What can have happened to the royal coach and the 10 little princes and princesses?" The royal coach, that's what they all would have been sitting in. The equivalent, or the thing that it would be today, would be the royal car. Okay? Although kings and queens have coaches even today that are drawn by horses, and quite often they come among the people in those. So it could be. "Oh dear, how very unlucky we are," said the miner's little boy, when they had been jostled right out of the crowd, and he wandered down the road in which they found themselves. Too sad to mind where it led, the little wooden horse trundled at his heels, wondering if there were any fortunes to be made in a city so full of people. They had both lost heart, so they were quite taken by surprise when the road led them straight into the palace yard. Straight into the palace yard. You know what the palace yard is? The palace is where the king and the queen live, and the princes and the princesses. And they were on the road that went straight into the palace yard, which is the sort of like the, it's sort of a bit like the area around the palace, a bit like the area around your house that belongs to you and belongs to the house. They pulled up before the door. They pulled up there, pulled up before the door was the beautiful coach, drawn by 9 white horses, for the 10th stood by, held by a groom. That's a horse attendant, someone who looks after the horses. Head dropping, great tears welling in its beautiful eyes, while a broken horseshoe lying on the cobbles showed at once what was the matter. There we go. There's a picture there of the horse with the attendant, the groom. And look what's laying on the ground at the groom's feet, those 2 pieces there. Broken horseshoe. That's what that is. It's a broken horseshoe. Beside the coach on the palace steps stood the king and queen and the 10 little princes and princesses, as sad a royal family as could be imagined or seen, for it was quite clear that the 9 white horses that were left could not pull the massive coach alone, and some of the children would have to be left behind. "Oh no, we can't have that." "We will try once more," said the king, looking anxiously at the great golden clock that towered over the palace. "Take your places, children, behind your mother, and we will see if, after all, the horses can manage to pull us all." The king and queen took their places. The royal footmen scrambled up at the back, for they could not be left behind. The little princes helped their sisters into their seats and climbed in themselves. All their little eyes sparkled, but their faces were anxious. Could the horses pull them all? We'll have to see. The grooms let go the heads of the 9 white horses. 9 flashing manes tossed in the air, 9 tails, white like floss silk, swished about their prancing legs, as with a mighty clatter and trampling, the loyal creatures put their shoulders to the collar and heaved at the great coach. With a mighty effort they drew it a few feet across the cobbles, and then they came to a standstill, pawing the ground and shaking their heads, as though to say, We have done our best. They will never draw us all around the city, said the king, and we are already 20 minutes late. We cannot disappoint the people. One at least of the children must remain behind, unless a 10th horse is brought within 3 minutes. You say you have inquired elsewhere? That's what the king said. You say you have inquired elsewhere? Everywhere, your majesty, the grooms replied. Everywhere. They've inquired everywhere for another horse, because it would sort of have to match too. It'd be a matching horse. It'd be a bit hard to find a matching horse. All the horses have gone into the country for the harvest. Oh, so that's part of the problem too. They're all out doing the harvest in the fields, so there were no horses to be had. The king now turned to his children, most of whom were in tears. They were all crying. Belinda, you must come. You and Ivor are the eldest. Helena, April, and Merlin had better come. And the twins, we cannot separate them. And Robin and Marigold, we promised them last year, and I will not break my word. Then, Madeline, you are the youngest. You must stay behind. Oh, dear. I wonder what's going to happen. The youngest princess, with tears streaming down her cheeks, though she tried in vain to hide them in her pocket handkerchief, stumbled out of the coach, and without a backward look at her luckier brothers and sisters, fled up the stairs into the palace. She ran up the stairs into the palace. The princes and princesses wept in sympathy. They wept as well. They cried as well for their little sister that couldn't come. The queen wiped a tear from her cheek as well. And the king gnawed at his moustache. The footmen and grooms might not show their feelings, but all the pleasure was gone out of their bearing. And as for the horses, they turned their heads mournfully toward the palace entrance, and the sorrow in their beautiful eyes said plainly, "We did our best. We did our best. Please don't blame us, dear princess." The coachman whipped up the horses, who strained once more at their golden harness, and the coach rumbled heavily across the cobbles toward the entrance to the yard. It had not rolled 20 yards before the horses came suddenly to a standstill. 20 yards. That's about from the top of the steps in your house there, George and Abby, probably down to close to where Dad's car's parked, down at the bottom of the hill. Or actually, no, closer would be from the bottom of the stairs, where you step out onto the driveway, down to where your dad's car's parked. That's about 20 yards. Okay? So the coach had not rolled 20 yards before the horses suddenly came to a standstill. "What is it now?" cried the king, who was getting impatient, while the youngest two remaining princesses at a look from their mamma, prepared to scramble down and follow their sister without further delay. But a footman who had run at once to the horses' heads now came running back to the king in some excitement. "If you please, your majesty, there's a strange little wooden horse that has come into the yard from no one knows where, and he says he can take the place of your majesty's 10th horse. The little wooden horse was stepping up to do the job. He says he's a quiet little horse and strong, and he thinks he may suit your majesty well, and he's worked in the mines, your majesty, and in the fields, and he can pull like any 10 horses, he says. And we know that he can." "Harness him at once," roared the king. "Harness him at once." That is, hook him up with the rest of the horses at once. For the hands of the golden clock pointed to the half hour, and far off in the city he could hear the murmur of the people awaiting their king. So while the grooms rapidly harnessed the little wooden horse at the head of the 9 white horses, the eldest prince ran indoors to tell his sister to dry her eyes and wash her face quickly, for she had to come after all. Wow. Now here's a turn up for the books. And while all the fuss was about, the miner's little boy crept under the royal coach and clung to the axle like a little monkey. But he was seen by the groom, who brought him to the king, who told him to jump up behind with the footman. For if his little wooden horse was as strong as he announced himself, he could pull them all with ease. So all was smiles and laughter in the coach, as the princes and princesses wiped their eyes and blew their noses and hugged their little sister, and the footman sat up like two white candles with the miner's boy between them, and the king smiled and the queen smiled, and the horses sprang forward, led by the little wooden horse, the heavy wheels turning like windmills, for it was true that the little wooden horse knew how to pull. And here we've got a picture. Here we've got a picture of what's going on there. You got a picture there? There's the footman up there, standing at the back. Those two right at the back there, right up there. They're the two footmen, and they're there to open the door for the king and queen to get out of the coach. And we've got the man in the front who's guiding the horses. And look who's at the very front. Who's that? With 4 brand new wooden wheels, 3 new blue stripes, and a red saddle. It's a little wooden horse. And he's making up the 10 to pull the king's coach. Wow. And the king's little wooden horse who led them all. When at last they drove back to the palace, the king ordered the miner's boy and the little wooden horse to be comfortably housed in the kitchen apartments for as long as they liked to stay. Next day he would reward them both. Before they went indoors, the youngest princess ran and flung her arms around the neck of the little wooden horse. Wow, he's becoming quite a notoriety, isn't he? Becoming quite well known, this little wooden horse. He's moving in good circles now. If it hadn't been for you, I would have been left at home, she said to him. Don't go away at once. Let me see you again tomorrow, and the next day, and the next. And she blew 100 kisses down his little wooden ears before her elder sisters called her indoors. Oh, isn't that something? Isn't that something? The adventures of the little wooden horse. He's having some pretty good adventures there, all right, isn't he? And now we're up to the next chapter. And the next chapter is, of course, chapter 10, The Little Wooden Horse Runs a Race. There it goes there, and that will be what we read to you next time we read. Okay, so I'll see you later for now, and I'm looking forward to reading to you again next time, eh? Okay, Toogle Poogle, love you all, cheerio.